Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 51. Yep, we've passed the half century. Well, let's hope we're still here for another half century, both in reality and in the Drydock. Now, as promised, as in the previous Drydock, I have managed to get some form of merchandising shop open. It's just a basic spreadshirt shop at the moment, so link in the description if you want to go to there. I've tried to enable the various options that seem the most useful to you. In terms of drop-down menu with Drachisms of the day, I haven't been able to find out if I can do that. I've done my best, however I have enabled the modification section where you can add text of your own, so if you happen to have a particular favourite Drachism of the day, you can add that to your choice of merchandise. And I will be trying to compile some of the ones that I find quite amusing on reflection, based mostly, to be perfectly honest, on Kevin Kenley's wonderful summations in various YouTube comment sections, and I will try and provide that as a PDF somewhere. I know a few of you in the comments and on Discord have also asked for other item type objects like smart shirts, as opposed to t-shirts, and I will be doing my best to get that sorted over the next few weeks. It may come down to the fact that if you want something that's beyond that, just email me and I'll sort it out for you one way or the other. So yes, and if you do need to email me, the channel email is 5minuteguides@gmail.com. That's all spelt, no capitalization or spacing. So 5, the word, 5minuteguides@gmail.com. And of course, suggestions for additional designs, etc., always welcome, either in the comments or via email. I have quite a few people have said the gigantic superstructures of Doom one was quite amusing, so I will be looking at finding a way to incorporate that into a design at some point. Now, of course, related to all of that is the 50k subs giveaway, so those winners to be announced in a minute. Again, please contact me via email to be advised of your choice of prizes and how to receive them. But before I do that, I must say, while I was reflecting on the fact that, well, we've now actually blown right past 50k, which is quite nice, but when we reached 50k, it caused me to reflect a little bit on exactly where this channel was a couple of years ago, which was a very small, little bitty channel that was just doing the 5-minute guides on Saturdays, and they were, of course, in the classic old text-to-speech. So haven't we come a long way since then? But the other thing that occurred to me was that obviously this figure could not be possible without the subscribers. Seems fairly obvious on the face of it, but I thought I'd give a shout out and a thank you to some of the earliest subscribers who had a lot of interaction with me right back when the channel was small. If you are an original subscriber, one of the early sort of first 500 or whatever, and I'm not including your name in this list, please don't feel left out. This is an abbreviated list based effectively purely on the first names that came to mind, who aren't also continually in the Discord talking to me anyway. So yes, people like KWolfX, DoorCF, Alfredo Sierra, Tamenga88, Diego Salvati, 99 Iron Duke, SSE Western, Thel Vadami, Santiago Trujillo Tobon, and Joe Francic. Yeah, you guys were there pretty much from the start, and most of you I've seen pop up now and again in comments more recently, so I hope you're all still here. I hope you're still enjoying the content, and thank you very much for being some of those initial feet in the door that helped this whole thing get started. And a couple of other quick shout-outs to a few people that I've noticed in the comment section, fairly active. Obviously, we've mentioned Kevin Kenley with his wonderful Drachisms of the Day summations, but I'd also like to give a special shout-out to Sar Jim. I know he's been around for a fair while, but the amount of additional information that he provides to the viewership through his extensive, well thought out and very well presented YouTube comments is very, very much appreciated. Please don't think I've missed you, because I have noticed that, and it's always a bright part of my day when I'm reading through the comments of a video to see several long paragraphs by Sar Jim. Another one, which I must say, is Versus Arch. I don't know exactly when you subscribe to the channel, Versus Arch, but I hope you're enjoying it. And yeah, Versus Arch usually posts things that disagree with me, different opinions and such. But again, it's a very valued contribution. You may disagree with the point I've made. You may have an alternate interpretation, and that's absolutely fine. There are multiple ways to look at so many things in naval history. And yeah, apart from anything else, that this is kind of like me saying, I don't mind people who disagree or want to argue with me as long as it's done in a polite, calm, and rational manner, which Versus Arch never fails to do. And yeah, he even agrees with me sometimes, so that's always good. I must really have hit the nail on the head when he's got nothing but good things to say about a video. But yeah, so thank you to you two guys, and thank you to everybody else as well. I'll probably pick up a few more later on in other dry docks, but considering that this is going on for quite a bit of the channel admin section, I guess I'll have to extend this dry dock to make up for it. So with all that said, the actual 50k subscriber competition winners, picked entirely at random from the list of, at the time, 186 replies to the post in question, are as follows: Yogi Khan, Andrew and Pat, that's one username apparently, Eric24567, Corporal Tommy, and Lordship Mayhem. So if those 5 individuals would like to get in contact with me over the course of the next week or so, if I haven't heard from them by the time I'm recording the next dry dock, I'll select however many additional replacements are needed so that there are 5 giveaways. So, with all of that said, how about we actually get on with some Q&A? So the videos we're pulling questions from for the first part this week are the video on USS San Juan and part 1 of the World's Worst Warships review. Obviously the World's Worst Warships review, there were so many ships involved there that, well, to list the sources used for all of those would take forever and a day, so let's not bother unless anyone is particularly interested in a particular one, and in which case let me know in the comments below and I'll tell you. The USS San Juan video, that was drawn from, as you might imagine, the usual suspects, but particularly a rather interesting book called The Panther Strikes, which is a short history of USS San Juan itself, which was published shortly after the Second World War, and is a very interesting read. Dave asks, I'm really looking forward to your Warrior to Pre-dreadnought special. That's the successor to the Age of Sail to Steam special. Any chance it could be moved higher on the list? I do want to get it done as soon as possible, trust me. It is, however, taking quite the bit of research to do because, well, I think as I've mentioned in other videos, that era is probably the single most rapid advance in technology ever seen on the face of the planet, at least as far as naval technology is concerned. So, yeah, the script I've got so far is quite extensive, and that's after a lot of editing and cutting down. I have a feeling I might actually have to split it down even further. I might have to split it into broadside ironclads up to turret ships and then do a separate section on turret ships. So we might have to look at 1860s to 1870s and then 1870s to 1890s, because especially in that first decade, the sheer level of different technologies that come into play. You've got broadside ironclads, central battery ironclads, multi-decked ironclads, the first attempts at turret ironclads, initially some first rams, plus of course you have the entire developmental history start to finish of the US monitors. That in and of itself is a huge subject, so yeah, ASAP, once I'm happy with the research and once I'm happy, I'm not going to give you a 4-hour monologue, but we'll see how that goes. To be perfectly honest, I can't see it being released in the next few weeks, possibly even a couple of months. I'd probably look towards autumn this year. Don't worry, there's plenty of other stuff lined up in between. Chris 2004 asks, why didn't the US Navy keep the Prinz Eugen in service to their Navy instead of using it in Operation Crossroads? Well, there's a number of reasons. The easiest one is that it would have been a one-off ship, and maintaining a one-off ship, especially a one-off ship from a foreign power in your navy, is incredibly difficult because all the spare parts, etc., you either have to learn how to manufacture them yourselves in very small quantities relative to the rest of your fleet, or you have to keep going back to Germany and trying to dig up spares, which, given the state of Germany at the time, given with the Allied air forces having done their best to level it to a very nice, plain, flat surface, was somewhat difficult. There's also the fact that although Prinz Eugen was probably the best of the Hipper-class cruisers, it would by no means be the best heavy cruiser that the US Navy could have in service at the end of World War II. They had plenty of Baltimores, and they had the Des Moines coming in as well. Either class significantly superior to any Admiral Hipper-class cruiser, including Prinz Eugen, and that's before we get into the rafts of other earlier heavy cruisers they had on hand. And then finally was the rather pertinent fact that due to the, shall we say, temperamental nature of the ship's machinery, the minute the Prinz Eugen's original crew had been allowed to return home and the US engineers, who assumed some degree of sanity had gone into the manufacture of Prinz Eugen's propulsion system, were left in charge, the majority of Prinz Eugen's propulsion system took itself off to its own personal Führer bunker and shot itself, disassembling in a rather spectacular manner that left the ship basically crippled. I think at one point they were down to a single working boiler. So basically, when it came down to it, the US Navy did not need a ship of Prinz Eugen's type when they had ships that were considerably superior to it, didn't break every 5 minutes, and where they could actually source spares from local areas. Nico the Cat asks, why was the French aircraft carrier Bearn so bad? Bearn suffered from so many issues. Part of it, to be perfectly honest, was the fact it was a very early carrier, and none of the very early carriers came out of things looking particularly brilliant. I mean, you're talking about, well, HMS Argus, which is a contemporary, at least at the time that they thought about the initial start of works on Bearn. You've got Eagle, which was alright but not brilliant, Hermes, which was tiny, Hosho, which, again, fairly small, Langley, which was basically not really a carrier by the time of World War II. The reason Bearn tends to get a lot of stick, however, is that it ends up looking quite bad even compared to them, because remember, all of those ships are early 20s ships. Bearn starts life in 1914 as a Normandy-class battleship, and so possibly the most direct comparison you'd be looking at would be Karga and Eagle, which are also battleship conversions. However, both Karga and Eagle are actually completed long before Bearn commissions, which it takes until 1927 to turn it into a carrier, and at that point you've got, well, Karga and Eagle, and you've also got other conversions like Lexington, Saratoga, Furious, Glorious, Courageous, and Akagi. And compared to them, Bearn looks really bad, but if we look just for a minute at Eagle and Karga, the differences are quite stark. I mean, the Normandy class were not particularly the largest battleships ever put into the water, and they're also quite slow. So Eagle is about 24 knots, Karga is about 28 knots. Both of those have issues later in the service because of that speed. Bearn can only make 21.5 knots, which is, well, it's pushing it, to say the least, in terms of actually being able to operate aircraft, certainly once they start to get heavier in the sort of mid-interwar period and onwards. The air group's not terrible. It's 35 to 40. I mean, for a ship that's only about 22,000 tons at light load, it's got an air group that's theoretically comparable with Eagle. But yeah, basically, it kind of encapsulates everything that's terrible about of converted and early carriers in one package. It's small, it's slow, its air group is nothing to write home about, it's not got particularly the best laid out flight deck, and it happens to end up fighting a conflict, well, being part of a conflict, we should say, that being World War II, where ships that are completed before it, as we said, things like Courageous, Glorious, Furious, Saratoga, Lexington, Akagi, etc., are significantly better than it because of the sheer amount of time it takes to convert it. So yeah, it's just not a good carrier. It wasn't a good carrier when it was finished, and it definitely wasn't a good carrier by World War II. John Jungling asks, with San Juan's multiple batteries of AA guns, was there any thought of using her as an anti-aircraft missile boat in the post-war era, or was she too small? Basically the latter. She was too small. I mean, the Atlantas were never the largest class of cruisers to begin with in terms of displacement, and on top of that, early missile systems were somewhat large, shall we say. Missile launchers for the early missile systems like Sea Slug and Talos tended to look a little bit like entire pieces of factory-grade industrial machinery that had somehow mysteriously made their way to sea, to the point that when they were considering converting things like entire battleships, like the uncompleted Iowas, to ships equipped with surface-to-air missiles, even they, or the large cruisers like the Baltimores, and when they were considering the Alaskas as well, were basically looking at the removal of entire main battery turrets. So you're talking triple 16-inch guns, triple 8-inch turrets, triple 12s, which are all considerably bigger than a twin 5-inch 38 caliber turret, which is what the San Juan's main armament was. And with those much larger turrets removed, they were talking about either single or twin arm missile launchers. So I don't think you could physically have gotten a lot of the early surface-to-air missiles on an Atlanta, and even if you had, their weight probably would have exacerbated the top-heavy issues that the Atlantas were already known for. Eric Johansson asks, why did steam and steel warships have copper on their hull? As I mentioned in one video, that ships need a layer of wood to separate the copper from the steel and iron. This is basically because the coppering is there to keep marine organisms away. Now, obviously, on an iron ship, you don't need to worry so much about shipworm as compared to a wooden ship. Or I suppose if you do need to worry about shipworm on an iron ship, you've probably got bigger things to worry about than just the fact that you didn't copper the hull recently. But no, anyway. The reason for the coppering, as I say, was to keep the marine organisms away, and it wasn't the shipworm in the iron ships' cases. It was primarily things such as barnacles and weed and other things that foul the hull, make the ship a lot slower and less fuel efficient. And basically these marine organisms truly do embrace the principle of that which does not kill me only makes me stronger. They will stick to anything that is not actively trying to kill them. As it so happens, copper is toxic to them. So copper plating is a very good way of keeping your ship's hull underside clean for a considerable portion of time. Obviously, the problem with that, as you allude to, is the electrolytic effect of having iron or steel in water right next to the copper, which creates an electric current and erodes both, which is not good. So you need the wood insulating layer. This lasted until they were able to come up with paint compounds that didn't just come off within the first few weeks at sea, that contained various wonderful materials, including copper, but not also things like cobalt and other such toxic metals, which had the same effect as the copper plating, but without the need for the electrolytic effect. And so anti-fouling paint, once it was invented, very rapidly displaced copper plating. This one's a bit of a combo question. I'm sort of mashing together one from Bill Cunningham's question and another from Lady Ponfar's question, which is basically, have I ever written a book on ships, and if so, what's the title? Or indeed, do I plan to? Well, no, I haven't. Well, I haven't written any books that are available in the public domain. I've written a couple of books for personal consumption, where I basically threw together a series of chapters based on family ancestry. That's just for personal family consumption, tracing genealogies and various people who basically spent the better part of the last millennia stabbing, shooting, or hitting people over the head in the military. But that's by the by. In terms of public, no, I haven't published any publicly available books. Do I plan to? Probably, actually, to be fair. Taken a bit of a theme off of various people's suggestions and requests in the comments. So I think maybe over the Christmas holidays I will draft up a first pass at Drax top 10 or possibly more worst warships. And yes, I will write it in the manner that I tend to speak, hopefully. So it will be a little bit sarcastic, a little bit flippant, a little bit off the hook. But what else do you expect, to be perfectly honest? It will have, I hope, perfectly good information, perfectly valid information, just not presented in a very dry style. Hopefully it'll make a few people laugh. But yes, spoilers. At some point a few years down the line, I'd also like to write a book about the interwar fleet air arm, because there doesn't seem to be a particularly good one about that period around. Vince Cuevas asks, effectively, what were the most critical developments in ship design, be that construction of ship and guns, armour, etc., in the pre-dreadnought era that spurred the further advancement of naval design and warfare? If I had to narrow it down to a single technological advancement in the pre-dreadnought era that spurred further developments, I would have to say probably central fire control and its associated range-finding gear. And I say that purely because up until that was developed, the pre-dreadnought paradigm of a couple of turrets with heavy guns to finish off the ship and lots of smaller guns and close-range fighting was probably about correct. Yes, the development of naval guns that could shoot further helped to spur on the dreadnought era, but obviously accuracy decreases as range increases, and if it hadn't been for the advent of more advanced rangefinders that could actually give the range out to longer distances, as well as centralised fire control, which could direct those guns with a lot more accuracy over numerous turrets, without that I don't think you would have seen the all-big gunship arrive anywhere near as close to 1906 as it historically did. Because, well, an all-big gunship, yes, it'll be able to shoot further, but it wouldn't be able to hit anything, and by the time it gets to a range where you can hit, the enemy's smaller guns probably would have overwhelmed you. Cody85 says, you keep mentioning the Glorious class were structurally too light for their 15-inch guns. What would have been a more appropriate calibre for their main armament? As built, none, because as built their hulls were so terribly weak that the sea could bend them out of shape. Once they'd been strengthened, given their sheer size, and, well, almost non-existent armour, it's very difficult to say, because they really are too lightly built to ever consider really putting capital ship armament on them. But at the same time, they're so vast that cruiser-grade guns would look absolutely silly. I don't know if any of you have got the Ohotnik or seen one in World of Warships, but yeah, putting a sort of a 6-inch cruiser gun or cruiser guns on them would probably end up looking like a giant sort of 20,000 ton plus version of that. If given the time period and given their size, I would say probably the best they could have done would be to try and maybe almost a really weird retrograde step and reinvent the ship that everyone thought the Invincible class was going to be and put multiple 9.2-inch turrets on it and make it into, I guess, what you might call a proto-heavy cruiser. A really, really heavy cruiser. That's about the best I can think of, to be honest. I mean, sticking numerous single 7.5s on it is going to look stupid, almost as bad as the 6s. So yeah, you're going to have you don't want to be putting a capital ship grade weaponry on a hull like that. So yeah, either multiple twin 9.2-inch turrets or possibly reinvent triple turrets, although it's a little bit early for the Royal Navy. Maybe you end up looking something like an Atlanta or a Dido with 9.2-inch turrets. That'd be quite amusing. And finally, for this section at least, something asks, how would Vanguard compare to a post-1941, i.e. post-refit, Hood? That's an interesting one, because actually when the Royal Navy was building the Vanguard, they actually pointed out that Hood was pretty much the only ship that Vanguard would be comparable to. So if we think about the potential Hood refits and the details, exactly which refit they went for, and within that which particular options they selected, would obviously influence it quite a bit. But if we go with the sort of maximal refit and my choice of AA as from the options that they were thinking about, then if Hood goes in for a full deep refit, it's going to be superior to Vanguard in speed by probably 3 to 4 knots. The Vanguard is going to have considerably better armour protection because, well, 13 to 14 inches of armour versus 12 inches, albeit Hood does have a slope on its armour, but the Vanguard's armour scheme is going to be a holistic design, whereas Hood is going to be a sort of retrofitted type. So even though it's got that incline, the thinner nature of it and the less comprehensive coverage is going to be an issue. Torpedo defense, Vanguard is going to take the biscuit quite easily, unless Hood is massively bulged, which I don't really see them doing. Armaments-wise, in terms of pure gunpowder, they're probably pretty much going to be equal, because they're probably going to be given exactly the same modernised 15-inch turrets. Vanguard will have slightly superior long-term durability, because Vanguard was equipped with the 2 full fire control directors, whereas I suspect Hood would probably still be with the 1 single main fire control director and auxiliaries for individual turret sections. So Vanguard would have a slight edge in battle in main gunnery, but not that much. Seakeeping, Vanguard's going to take that quite easily. What else have we got? Secondary battery. Now this is going to be a bit of a toss-up, because they were thinking about 5.25s or 4.5s for Hood. I suspect, given that you're talking about the mid-war period, they probably would have gone for the 4.5, so Hood might actually have a superior anti-aircraft battery, at least until the 1944-45 era, when they finally fix most of the issues with the 5.25, purely because if they go with the 4.5s, well, it's more effective than 5.25 flat out in the early to mid-World War II period, and B, there's going to be more of them. So Hood might have the superior medium anti-aircraft, heavy anti-aircraft battery. Vanguard will have the superior light to medium anti-aircraft battery, because as completed, Vanguard had an all 40mm armament, whereas a 41-42 era refit Hood is probably going to have a mixture of 20s and 40s, and probably isn't going to have the full radar-directed 6-barrel 40mm. Probably more likely to have single, twin, and quad 40s. But overall, I think Vanguard is going to be the better warship, primarily due to its superior seakeeping, the fact that it's a ground-up design, so it's going to be a holistic arrangement of protection, weaponry, and speed. Hood's advantages would be purely in the areas of speed and possibly heavy anti-aircraft fire. But that said, a maximally refitted Hood is not going to be that far away from Vanguard in terms of pure naval fighting capability. Obviously, it's not going to last anywhere near as long, as Vanguard's brand new, but there you go. Now you've got me all nostalgic and wishing we could have seen refitted Hood and Vanguard sailing together. Now that would have been a fun sight. 99 Iron Duke asks, what if, in World War I, the Royal Navy's first cruiser squadron of the armoured cruisers HMS Defence, Black Prince, Duke of Edinburgh and Warrior, plus the light cruiser HMS Gloucester, had intercepted the German battlecruiser Goeben and light cruiser Breslau during their flight across the Mediterranean towards Turkey? What do you think the outcome would have been? So, for those of you unaware, this is actually one of the great what-ifs of World War I that, although they couldn't foresee it at that time, had some pretty major fallout. The Royal Navy 1st Cruiser Squadron, as detailed by 99 Duke, was on its way to intercept Goeben and Breslau when the Admiral in charge decided that he couldn't win the fight and therefore he was going to hold back. He had certain orders that could be interpreted as allowing him to do so, but he did later face a court-martial for not engaging enemy shipping. Now, as 99 Iron Duke points out, that the Germans have the 10 11-inch guns aboard Goeben, although given that 2 of those twin turrets are in echelon, practically speaking, its broadside is probably 8. And Breslau has 12 5.9-inch guns. Meanwhile, the British have at least 22 9.2-inch guns, 14 7.5-inch guns, and 26-inch guns scattered throughout their forces. So the British definitely have the preponderance of gun barrels, but could they have sunk or stopped Goeben? Now, the key thing to remember about this engagement is that Goeben and Breslau were being pursued by 2 of the British battlecruisers, the Invincible and one of her sister ships. So those ships are coming up behind it. They're not that far away. So if they'd engaged, could they have sunk Goeben? Maybe, maybe not. Could they have damaged or slowed her down so that Invincible and her sister could have arrived and then sunk her? Yeah, pretty much, almost certainly. I mean, Gloucester on its own is a pretty good match for Breslau, and if they detailed one of the other 4 armoured cruisers to help, then Breslau would probably be taken out pretty quickly. At least immobilised, crippled, basically rendered non-combat capable, which would allow those 2 ships to then join in the main fight with Goeben. But even so, even if the initial fight is just 3 armoured cruisers versus Goeben, 1, there's an awful lot more fire coming at Goeben than Goeben can dish out. 2, this is very early in the war, so they're not going to do what actually a bunch of these exact armoured cruisers did at Jutland, which is explode like Roman candles if they're hit, albeit they are relatively vulnerable. But it's 3 versus 1. Goeben cannot engage all 3 of those armoured cruisers at once. In fact, it would be fairly hard-pressed to engage 2 at once. It'd be physically possible, but the chances of scoring any hits would go down quite significantly. So Goeben is probably going to have to be engaging them 1 at a time. That leaves 2 armoured cruisers at least, not counting anything that might be coming up after finishing off Breslau, unengaged, which basically means effectively peacetime firing conditions, which means they can start smothering the ship. Now, you might ask, well, can Goeben maybe pull out of their gun range? Now, the answer to that is yes. Yes, it can. It is just about faster than the armoured cruisers. However, you've got to bear in mind one thing. If the armoured cruisers put themselves in its path, it's either got to get through them, or if it chooses to fall back and try and engage from longer range, then the armoured cruisers are doing their job of holding it in place, at which point the 2 12-inch battlecruisers are going to turn up behind Goeben, and that's curtains for that. So Goeben's only real chance in this particular battle, because of the constraints of the scenario, are to either gamble at a very long distance in terms of shooting and hope that it can cripple or destroy the entire cruiser squadron before Invincible and its sister show up, which probably isn't going to happen. Very unlikely. Or it's going to have to close in to where its gunnery is more accurate and try and lay waste to the first cruiser squadron that way, which it has a better chance of doing, especially if it's trying to just break through and keep going, albeit obviously if it does try and charge and break through, it's putting itself at risk of torpedo attack, especially from Gloucester. But if it does so, it comes into range of that ridiculous number of 9.2 and 7.5-inch guns. Now, yes, its main armour belt is capable of withstanding that kind of firepower, and probably so are its turrets. However, the superstructure, the ends of the ship, not so much. Secondary armament, things like that. And again, bear in mind, the first cruiser squadron does not necessarily have to sink at Goeben. It would be nice if they did, but they don't have to. all they have to do is slow it down, and if they can just plaster the ship in fire, open up enough holes and start enough leaks, that will slow Goeben down, that even if it does just charge headlong straight through their gun line, taking out a couple of them on the way, its speed's going to be reduced, at which point it's going to be overhauled and sunk by the 2 British battlecruisers following it, and probably whatever's left of the first cruiser squadron. So, yes, given the scenario that the first cruiser squadron was faced with, if they had engaged Goeben, it is very likely that their actions would have resulted in the sinking of Goeben, whether directly or indirectly. And of course, the reason that's a big butterfly is that without Goeben and Breslau arriving in Turkey, it's going to be a lot harder to persuade the Ottomans to enter the war against the Allies, which changes quite a bit of the First World War's history. Master of Dickery asks, would Germany have been better off building 3 improved Scharnhorst class with 15-inch guns, as opposed to trying to build the 2 Bismarck class, and possibly using some spare resources left to refit the first 2? So it'll come as little surprise to long-term viewers of the channel to know that I am in fact quite the fan of the idea of the 15-inch refitted Scharnhorst class. So yes, I think that would actually have been a much better idea. It gives Germany an extra hull. There's a much better chance that the ships will be finished sooner, so Germany will have more capital ships in place sooner, and assuming they have complete the refits before the war, also more heavily armed than historically, at least. And believe it or not, Scharnhorst's main belt is actually considerably thicker than Bismarck's. It's almost 14 inches thick, as opposed to Bismarck's 12.5-ish thick belt armour. Now, granted, Scharnhorst deck armour, the turtleback arrangement is thinner, and it doesn't have the upper strake of armour that Bismarck does above its main belt thickness, but at the same time, with that thicker belt armour, the thinner deck is probably fine. And yes, that upper strake is probably, the lack of it is probably what actually finally did in for Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape, but that's a somewhat unique shot. However, the guns, fire control, etc. are all good, and that would have placed the ships in a position where they could engage much heavier Royal Navy capital units. So if you look at, say, the action between Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Renown, historically, I mean, apart from the fact there's a raging storm, but historically speaking, the 2 German ships retreated before the 1 British ship, even though they were considerably better protected, largely because Renown was able to just keep hitting them with its own gunfire, and the 15-inch shells were considerably more effective in going one way than the 11-inch shells coming the other. There's a whole other load of factors going in, but one of the major issues was Renown's greater firepower. Now, if both of those ships had been armed with the German 15-inch guns as seen on Bismarck, then it's entirely the other way around. Likewise, when they go convoy raiding and they come across old battleships like Malaya, 11-inch gunfire, 2 ships, it's not worth it. 15-inch guns on both ships, I'm pretty confident they can take Malaya, and relatively handily, and so on and so forth. So yes, give them an extra hull, and so you have 5 ships that are all also, bear in mind, slightly faster than Bismarck. So you've got 5 well-protected battleships with German World War II era 15-inch guns. I think that gives you a hell of a lot more fighting capability than you historically had with the 2 Scharnhorst with 11-inch guns and drips and drabbing the Bismarck class in, as they did historically. So yeah, I support this product and or service. Waverley Wanderer asks, what if the UK had been allowed to retain the 2-power standard after the Washington Treaty with an 8-5-3 ratio of ships with the USA and Japan? Would it simply mean a larger number of obsolete ships in 1939 because anything else is unaffordable? I mean, if nothing else changes compared to historically, then pretty much almost certainly. I mean, by the time the war breaking out in 1939, even with the 553 standard, and taking into account the new construction that was the King George V's, the Royal Navy hadn't been able to upgrade and refit all of its warships to modern standards. I mean, actually the list was fairly short. It was Warspite, Valiant, Queen Elizabeth, Renown. That was it. Repulse. I mean, all the ships had been refitted to varying degrees in between the two wars, but that was the only modernised sections. Barham, Malaya, all the Revenge class, Repulse and Hood were nowhere near as up to date as those ships. Albeit that Royal Oak was a little bit above the other R's, but I've covered that previously. So, yes, with the finance they'd had, to be perfectly honest, if they'd been given an extra, well, if we're talking about an 853 and assuming that the 5 and the 3 stays at the same tonnage displacements as agreed at Washington, you're talking about another 9 capital ships that the Royal Navy would have to maintain. Quite which they would be a good question. I mean, obviously you've got Nelson and Rodney thrown into the mix there, but I mean, 9 capital ships. Tiger's the obvious one. That means 8, which basically 8 means keeping the Iron Dukes for 1, as well as the old King George V. So you'd have 2 squadrons of 13.5-inch gun battleships and a 13.5-inch gun battlecruiser, which I guess is keeping enough 13.5-inch guns in the fleet to make it worthwhile. But I don't think, to be perfectly honest, that there would be any chance with the historical economy of the UK keeping all those running, or if they did, refits and such would be relatively minimal. So they'd go in with a larger number of ships, but you probably wouldn't even have the 4 I mentioned earlier fully modernised, because they'd just be spending all their money keeping these extra 9 capital ships afloat. The alternative, because bear in mind the Washington Treaty ratios were initially by named ships but also by tonnage, so you might get a Royal Navy arguing that they'll maintain an 853 ratio by tonnage, and therefore arguing that they can build more larger, newer ships, maybe additional Nelsons, something like that, just to get rid of the others. So you might say a 4 or 6 ship Nelson class in order to ditch some of the older and more obsolete vessels. But then we're getting into real butterfly territory at that point. And so we move on to the Discord questions. Uncle Stirfry asks, what did the deck crew, anti-aircraft gunners, do to protect themselves from the overpressure and sound of the heavy guns on battleships? Well, pretty much what it says on the picture there. Run away! No, in all seriousness, generally speaking, if your main guns were firing, it was because you were engaging an enemy surface ship, at which point the exposed and rather less well-protected anti-aircraft battery would effectively be just an easy way of giving the enemy kills on your crew. So the anti-aircraft gunners and such would generally be allowed to go into sheltered areas, either in the superstructure or possibly just below deck, to keep them safe from incoming enemy fire and from the blasts of your own guns. This didn't necessarily always work out, because it meant that you had an awful lot of people congregated in a relatively small space. So if you did take a hit from a main gun shell in that area, as happened to both Hood and Bismarck during their respective final battles, that's a way of losing a lot of men very quickly. But nevertheless, that was the idea. So, and obviously when you are being under attack by aircraft, generally anti-aircraft guns do not equate to the main battery armament of a battleship, and so you can all be happily out on deck shooting away at the enemy aircraft because your main guns aren't going to be firing. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this. Obviously, the Japanese, with their Type 3 anti-aircraft main battery shells, and also in emergencies, the main batteries tended to be used to create massive water spouts, in the theory that this would either break up the attack or destroy aircraft that flew into the water fountains. So, and this was demonstrated by Bismarck during the various attacks by the Swordfish. HMS Nelson did it while it was being attacked by Italian and German aircraft. all sorts of people would eventually do this. The one saving grace of that was that it tended to be during torpedo attacks, because obviously doing it during a dive bomber attack isn't going to help very much, and also our guns didn't elevate that high. But a torpedo attack generally was trying to come in on the beam of the ship, which meant the guns would be trained out effectively at 90 degrees, which put the blast as far away from the ship as possible. And people just have to live with it. There is a reason why the vast majority of anti-aircraft guns tended to be sited either around the central superstructure or on top of superfiring turrets, and that was because in the event that you had to use both sets of guns at once, those were the areas that were the most shielded and less affected by the blasts of the main guns themselves. Deeks25 asks, you mentioned in a previous Drydock episode that the Royal Navy 15-inch 42 caliber gun was one of the more accurate naval guns. What was the reason for this? Was it a particularly good design, or was it more of a happy coincidence? It was a bit of both, really. The 15-inch 42 was rushed into production very quickly. It bypassed most of the normal testing phases, and it was effectively an extrapolation of the existing 13.5-inch gun that was equipping British capital ships at the time. Now, normally, that kind of very rushed, no testing process tends to result in something that's utterly terrible. However, in this case, the engineers who were working on it and the officers who were supervising it knew just exactly what was riding on this gun's development, and they knew their own professional careers were on the line for this. So what appears to have happened is that when it came to scaling up the 13.5-inch, they went completely to town on it. They overbuilt it and heavily engineered it to be a fine precision tool. There was no cutting corners, well, if we use a slightly stronger material, we can take X% of weight off of this, etc., etc. It was literally a case of this cannot fail, and if we need to put a couple of 100 kilos more steel in there to make sure it absolutely cannot fail, then we will. As a result of which, you got an incredibly solid gun that was incredibly stable, very, very non-susceptible to things like barrel droop, and as you said, the second part of it also comes in. It was a little bit of a happy coincidence in that all these efforts paid off, and they managed to produce something at effectively a shoestring and a very short amount of time that turned out to be actually incredibly stable and accurate as a gun. As I said, normally this kind of accelerated gun design process would go horrifically badly, but I think it's what I have to call the shed factor, i.e. the people who were designing this were pretty much operating in the similar manner to the way that a lot of good British inventions do, working out the back of a shed with not a lot of time and not a lot of money, so they were probably in a position to do a lot better than people who sat down at a desk and worked out how things would work theoretically before actually testing it. With the 15-inch 42, it was a case of, we know this works, let's do it bigger. And actually, speaking as an engineer, that usually works a lot better than sitting down and theorising it. Usually. Drylander asks, on the Fighters of the Essex class video, the FJ-1 Fury aircraft is shown. Are those bombs at the very end of the wings? Well, here's the FJ-1 Fury, and you can see exactly why those things on the wings could be taken for bombs. Well, they look remarkably like them, but they are, in fact, not bombs. They are fuel tanks. Specifically, they are non-sealing fuel tanks designed to give the Fury some extra range, as you can see here. The main fuel tanks of the aircraft are held in the fuselage, but to give that, as we said, give the aircraft a bit of extra range, as it is a naval aircraft and does need to operate at fairly long distance. So these are effectively precursors to the conformal fuel tanks that we brought in on much later aircraft. Drylander also asks, by reducing a designed ship's range, how much weight or space do you save? Is it significant? And why were coastal battleships so small? So you could save an awful lot of weight. I mean, if we take two roughly contemporary examples are one of very long range, one of very short range in terms of battleships, the Littorios and the South Dakotas. The South Dakotas, to achieve their long range necessary for operations in the Pacific, were carrying just over 6,500 tons of fuel, whereas the Littorios carried just over 4,000 tons. So, all other things aside, the Littorios were 2,500 tons approximately lighter at full load than the South Dakotas, based purely on the volume of fuel that they were carrying. That obviously doesn't account for the weight and space taken up by the fuel tanks themselves, which obviously you then don't need. And that means that either you have a lighter ship, or you can have a ship that, for the same displacement, can mount heavier guns, more powerful engines, or more powerful weapons. And 2,500 tons is quite a lot. I mean, when you're talking on a ship with a nominal standard displacement at 35,000 tons, maybe tipping over just over 40,000, you're talking about probably between 4 and 5% of the ship's overall displacement there that you've saved. And that can buy you something even as big as an entire main battery turret, potentially. So that's an awful lot of savings. Although obviously in this specific case of comparing the Littorio with the South Dakotas, the Italians mainly went for more speed and therefore more powerful machinery. Now, as for why coastal battleships were so small relative to contemporary oceanic battleships, it basically comes down to two things: cost and operational environment. If you're a nation that is investing in coastal battleships, it's almost certainly because you can't afford full-sized ones, which means if you can't afford a full-size one, you're not going to buy one, so you are automatically going to be buying a smaller ship because you have less money available. That's just simple logic. However, the other factor is operational environment, and a coastal battleship, as the name suggests, is going to be operating off the coasts, and given where many coastal battleships were found, i.e. in the Scandinavian countries, that often also means fjords and narrow inlets and passes between islands. That in turn means shallow draft and fairly tight manoeuvring space, and that in turn leads to the fact that a bigger, heavier vessel with a deeper draft would probably go aground in most of the spaces you'd be expected to operate in, or wouldn't be able to manoeuvre between rocks, shoals and islands. Therefore you need a smaller ship with better agility and a lighter depth of draft. So that's basically, in a nutshell, why coastal defence battleships tend to be much smaller than their ocean-going cousins, coupled with obviously the fact they don't need as much fuel. Grand Emperor Kurtz asks, on warships with multi-gun turrets, was it possible, and if so, was it done, to any extent, to fire only one barrel and not all of them at once, aside from obviously just simply loading one barrel? Well, as can be seen above, courtesy of one of the US Navy's Iowa class, yes, it is very much possible. In terms of whether it was done, again, yes. This was done for one of two reasons. One was if you were firing half salvos. In some navies and on some ships, it was held that it would be better to fire one gun from each turret, usually when you're talking about twin turrets, rather than fire, say, if you're using 4 twin turrets, fire 2 of the turrets and then fire the other 2. And this was basically because if you fired one gun from each turret in a half salvo, then the fall of shot was going to be roughly the same as if you fired the other gun from each turret, as opposed to if you fired, say, just your forward 2 turrets, your rear two turrets might have a slightly different fall of shot. So that's one reason why you might do it. The other reason was, as per HMS Rodney for a while against Bismarck, where you would fire a single shot for ranging purposes. So you'd fire a single shell first, you'd see where that landed, make some corrections to the elevation of the rest of the guns, and then fire a full salvo. So yeah, they did do single gun firing from various turrets at various points, and obviously also if a gun has jammed, you might have to fire 1 or 2 remaining guns in the turret if the jam isn't going to immobilize the turret completely. Deleted user, again, I don't know who this person actually is on Discord, but they've obviously deleted their user account. Again, if you are this person, please feel free to comment below. Yes, this is a fun one. I said it would be fun when he put it up there in the first place. Would it have been A, feasible, and B, worth the time, effort and money for the Royal Navy to purchase Brunel's SS Great Eastern in the 1860s and 1870s and proceed to convert her into the world's largest broadside ironclad battleship? Well, for those of you who are unaware, this is the SS Great Eastern, and yes, it was big, especially for the time period. Also, unusually, a ship that was powered by both paddle wheels and screw propellers, in addition to the large number of sails and masts that you can see up there. Now, when you say, oh, how big? What do you mean, Drac? Well, its displacement was 32,160 tons at the time that it came into service in 1859. That is huge. That is a displacement that would not be equalled by a battleship until the 1920s. And this is launched a year before the world's first ironclad warships are fully in service, being obviously Gloire and Warrior. So to give you some idea, Warrior already is pretty big. HMS Warrior, which is built and launched a year later, is quite the ship. And Warrior displaces just over 9,000 tons. So this ship displaces 3 times as much as HMS Warrior and change. It is almost double the length. Warrior is 420 feet. Great Eastern is 692 feet, so pushing 700 feet long. Warrior is 17.8 meters or 58 feet wide. Great Eastern is 82 feet or 25 meters wide. It's words fail to describe just how unimaginably large this ship was at the time of its launch. In terms of displacement and length, it wouldn't be matched for another 40 years until the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. Now with all that said and done, would it have made sense to be turned into the world's biggest warship? Hell no. As you can see, the technology involved at the time just wasn't up to propelling a ship of this size. Brunel had to throw everything at it to get it to work. And now, okay, fair enough. You could probably mount a broadside 3 or 4 times heavier than Warrior on the hull side space that you've got there, even with the paddle wheel in the way. But this ship was already clocking in at over 32,000 tons unarmoured. Can you imagine the displacement that would have been involved in trying to put armour on this thing? You would have ended up with a ship, assuming that the structure can hold, which, to be fair, it's a Brunel designed ship, it probably could. But yeah, so assuming Brunel's usual engineering competence and the thing can actually support enough 4.5, 5-inch thick armour to armour a substantial portion of the ship to make a citadel, you're going to be talking about a ship that would break the displacement limits of the Washington Naval Treaty as pretty much the world's first armoured warship. One, I don't think there's any way the Royal Navy, even in the height of its Victorian era splendour, could justify the expense of buying this thing. 2, the cost of converting it. 3, the cost of running it. I mean, this was the reason it didn't actually work commercially. It was just so ridiculously expensive to run. But assuming that there's a magical money printing machine that is immune to the effects of inflation through temporal paradox or something, if you did somehow manage to convert this thing into some kind of broadside ironclad, there's precious little anyone else can do to stop it. It's going to be slow, it's going to be ponderous, and it's never going to stop. This is the kind of thing you could take to something like the Battle of Lissa, and this would be one entire side, and the other side would be composed of an entire nation's fleet. To be perfectly honest, that said, if the Royal Navy did, for whatever reason, decide to go down the mad route of trying to turn this into some kind of gargantuan warship and didn't do the obvious thing and turn it into a troop transport, I can rather suspect them trying to offload it as soon as possible to some kind of secondary navy, where it pretty much would form their entire navy, which would be quite amusing, to be perfectly honest. So yes, in a sane world, absolutely no. In a fun fantasy world, yeah, you've basically created... Well, actually, yeah, you basically created the equivalent of bringing HMS Dreadnaught into this period, except it's even bigger. By the time you're through and done with all the conversions, you're probably looking at something more on the order of a South Dakota or an Iowa being dragged back into the 1860s. Only the technology, in theory, is available to keep this thing running. Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic concept. It's crazy as all hell, but I do like it. And finally, Life Beyond Living asks, what would have happened if the 3 ships of the Battlecruiser Squadron were at the Denmark Strait instead of just Hood and Prince of Wales? Well, if you've got Renown, Repulse, and Hood there, I mean, obviously a lot of it's going to come down to whether or not the Golden BB that sinks Hood happens again, but in most runs of the scenario that I could put through 2 or 3 different, well, depending on whether you want to call them games or naval simulators. Don't worry, I wasn't using World of Warships, apart from anything that don't have the renowns in there, but never mind. But anyway, after probably about 2 dozen total runs, the balance comes down to the Royal Navy probably wins, but they almost certainly lose 1 battle cruiser and possibly 2. And it basically comes down again to tyranny of numbers. Any one of those ships is a match for Prinz Eugen, and Renown is a very good gunnery ship. So if, say, Renown and Hood engage Bismarck, and Repulse engages Prinz Eugen, and it's very likely that with Renown and Repulse being in better condition than Hood, they're probably going to be leading the formation. So whichever is the lead battlecruiser, in this case, we'll probably say Repulse, which is actually kinder on the Germans. Repulse engages Prinz Eugen. Renown and Hood engage Bismarck. Bismarck is almost certainly going to engage the biggest threat, which is Hood. Unfortunately for them, that means that Renown gets free gunnery practice on Bismarck. Bismarck will start taking hits, assuming that Hood doesn't instantly blow up in the same kind of situation that you get with the historical Battle of the Denmark Strait. Then either it or whichever of the 2 renowns Bismarck chooses to engage probably gets hit badly enough to be sunk before Bismarck itself is rendered combat ineffective. The variance is basically whether or not enough of Bismarck and Prinz Eugen's firepower is maintained to do critical damage to either Renown or Repulse. But it basically just comes down to that. It's like, well, the Prinz Eugen isn't going to win a fight with the battlecruiser that picks on it. And when it comes down to the other 2, it's 2v1. One of them has free target practice. It's pretty much curtains for Bismarck, albeit that obviously it does take a long time, because rendering Bismarck combat ineffective is one thing and is relatively easy to do in the grand scheme of things compared to some other battleships. Rendering it sunk, as its last stand proved, is quite the different matter. So, yeah, marginal victory to the Royal Navy. And that brings us to the end of Drydock episode 51. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you in another video. And as I said, announcements about winners to the 50k subscriber giveaway back at the beginning in channel description, and announcements about merchandise and stuff, because apparently some of you want it, so you will have it. Simple as that. And yeah, contact details, as I said before, 5minuteguides@gmail.com. All using words, no caps. Thanks very much. See you again later.